Athens, Birth of Politics. First gripe, the box doesn't stand up properly. Okay. So, anyway, this is based on Republic of Rome, which is a very, very cool design. And Rick Kelly and Up and Away Games. I know I didn't put the links in on the intro either. I'll try to get them in. Have put out a series of games now based on that Republic of Rome engine, one way or another. The closest to it is Republic of Carthage. The furthest away is Founding Fathers, which has some very, very different systems, but still has that kind of feel to it. And this lies somewhere in between, using mostly the Republic of Rome system, but with some significant changes to it. Obviously, Republic of Carthage, one of the reasons that it matches very closely is it's meant to be able to be played in conjunction with Republic of Rome, which I did in my video for it. That's very cool. Out of the bunch, I like Founding Fathers the best, honestly. But this one's an exciting subject matter. And I do really like the Republic of Rome design. But I felt like there are a few issues with this one that kind of, yeah, my wife doesn't like the gray, so I get to play every now and then. Well, let's start taking a look at what in particular. First of all, component-wise, all these little cubes. I really like the ice cubes. They're pretty. That's what they call them here. I like the metallics. All kinds of cool stuff in terms of looks. I found that the only thing you have to distinguish with these, though, is color. And if you got a color blindness issue, that's going to be a problem. You can make your own pieces that help fix that. You can mark up the cubes in some way to help yourself. But you're going to have to do something because it really is color dependent as it stands. I had some trouble with some of the color choices. The yellow and orange end up kind of close to each other in my lighting, and I don't know. That's probably the only pair. The purple and red I also had trouble with. Yeah, but I don't have very good lighting here, turns out. I thought I had great lighting. It isn't that great. Bunch of counters. You have a few different, I don't know, I have these kind of jumbled together because I didn't want to use a lot of bags. These are all laser cut. Punching them, my hands were black afterwards because it didn't include the little napkin that the VPG games do. This is actually probably the worst blackening I've gotten off of the laser cutting. I'm used to laser cut pieces, but my hands were really, really black after this, and I kind of wish I had wiped it down beforehand. Might be a good idea. The one problem I have with the counters, well, I have a couple issues. One is the popularity counters, which are very important to be able to draw and determine which facing they are. The laser cutting makes that hard to do. So you may not want to put them in a cup. You may want to actually keep them in a pool somewhere, if you can tolerate that. And the other problem was the money. The 25 talent pieces, they're unreadable, so you can't tell. The color meshes so well with the background that you can't really tell whether you've got a front or a back of a counter. And so if somebody's looking at a counter trying to figure out which side's the front or back, you know they're holding the 25 in that case. The color on that should be a little bit more distinct. The actual cards, there are a number of, there are so many different types of cards. I guess a couple of things. The Game Crafter cards, I'm noticing, it got significant work. Now I play them I put decks facing different ways, so that's why you're seeing such a discontinuity there. But basically, all the cards are warping inward fairly badly. I have a decent amount of humidity here, so that probably affects it. This is probably the worst warping I've seen on something that I've gotten so early, although I have noticed the Game Crafter cards tend to warp a little more than usual. That doesn't affect play so far. It just is kind of like, wow, that's really odd that they warp so much. So the actual cards have on them some symbols. For example, this delta here, which tells you which deck they belong to. And one thing that I've noticed is in the people cards, different things have the symbol in different places. So the law cards all have their time symbol up above, whereas everything else has the time symbol down below. Also, some of the people cards, some of the actual statesman cards have symbols that show find one, that show who they, the fact that they might have a descendant or are descended from someone, kind of right near where the deck symbol exists. What I found was, both in setting up the game and then tearing it down so that it's easier to set up next time, that it was hard to determine quickly which symbol was where. Maybe a single color that's different for the deck symbol is there. As one example, I'm pretty sure the 10 Tribes card, I'm pretty sure I got that slipped into the original deck, the beta deck instead of the gamma deck. Interesting story about that. Where I grew up, we had we had a middle school, and we had it divided into the first Greek letters of the alphabet, into the different wings. But we always spoke them as alpha, beta, delta, gamma. And so that's stuck in my head as kind of the ordering. I know it's wrong, but it's just a funny thing that, like, I'm always wondering, is that just sort of the natural way to say it? Or, was that just weird for my town or something? Or maybe it was just me. Maybe the rest of the town didn't say it that way, but I think we all kind of did. The rule book. The rule book has an interesting issue with it. So it's divided into a rule book and what looks like a playbook. You read the rule book and you're kind of like, I feel like I'm missing something. Well, you are. Certainly you're missing the scenario information in the playbook. That's understandable. But what you're missing is the glossary. And the glossary has detailed information, including stuff that is necessary to understand the rulebook. And I don't think there's sort of a look at the glossary. Damned if I know, because I'm really bad at following rules, right? But I don't remember anywhere where it says, hey, you really should read the glossary first. For me, I found myself reading the rulebook first, which is what I always turn to first. I don't look, usually if there is a glossary like that, it's usually historical information about the characters. That's all on the cards, which is fine. But yeah, that was a real discontinuity to me. And as soon as I had that figured out, and sort of the distinction between the decks was another kind of complicated thing for the scenarios. But as soon as I had that figured out, it made the rule book a lot easier to understand, but it wasn't something I understood until I started playing it all. And was like, well, the rule book really ought to cover this. I don't see it. I felt like I was missing. Okay. And that caused me a great deal of angst. It's got a player aid, and there's some cards that cover, sort of the key issues in the player aid. There's quite a bit of information in this. A lot of this information in Republic of Rome would have been printed on the board. but the board is heavily used here. Maybe a little smaller too, but it's a nice hard board with a number of different tracks, most of what you need. This one maybe you don't need, but I found it useful. And a lot of neat stuff. Okay, so let me cut into the game itself. If I can only keep this potato of a pipe lit. These are these weird wooden ones I bought. And when I first got them, they burned a little better, but now they don't draw very well, and they're hard to clean. I think they were not a great buy. Okay. Well, let me look through the sequence of play. So it starts off with a standard kind of income type handling, much like Republic of Rome does. And this is almost all mechanical stuff. You just take in the money that you're owed, and you pay the money from the state that it's not owed, or that it owes, and the players, statesmen collect income based on, whatever concessions essentially they have, whatever businesses they have, and the leader gets more than the others. You pay for any personal troops you have. Once you enter the oligarchy, personal troops become important because there's the possibility of a coup happening inside Athens. And this is one of the big differences. This is the way you can win the game in a similar fashion to trying to overthrow the emperor or to trying to overthrow the Senate in Republic of Rome. Sorry. Thoughts about combining it with Imperium Romanum, I think, slipping in there. One of the interesting things about this game is that, like in the expansion, I believe, and I was already toying with this, for Founding Fathers, you have factions that players are assigned to. Now, you have factions in Republic of Rome, but they're meaningless. In this, you're only easily able to attract statesmen from your general class. So if you're the class of aristocrats, all you will be able to normally get is aristocrats. You can convince statesmen from other classes to join you, but you can't just play them. And there's other restrictions that prevent you from being able to do that easily. Now, one thing I noted was when I was in the middle of the Gamma deck, I was like, wow, I'm getting a lot of aristocrats. That deck's a little aristocrat heavy. The others seem to be more balanced, but that particular deck seems to have a significant, like a couple extra aristocrats in it compared to the other classes. And that's when I was noticing, wow, I'm getting a lot here. And I expected, when the oligarchy officially actually happened, that there'd be even more. And that caused some angst in my head and some additional evidence that maybe players should be able to shift their class. But the simplistic mechanism I came up with is probably too easy. And again, I'm not positive of the historical viability of what I'm talking about. I just don't know enough about the Greek democracy and its politics beyond, the light skimming that really is actually probably less than I get from looking at games. Okay. You are allowed to exchange things at this point in the sequence of play. And that can cause a certain problem because it appears that you could actually work out mutual trades that end up reapportioning money into or out of your treasury, which normally you should only be able to do at another stage in the game. And it's actually kind of... Republic of Rome has this problem too, but it allows you an opportunity to kind of, if you're working with someone else, to fiddle your money around a little bit. And I'm not sure how much I like that, but I don't know if there's a way to stop that really without restricting trade too much. You can give money to Athens, which might be important. What I found was Athens doesn't have a lot of money, but it also doesn't have a lot of troops it can build. It can build a big navy, and that's reasonable. But the biggie is it's hard to come up with the ground forces that you need for the big wars. And there might be reasons that they're hard, that you need a lot more ground forces than they historically were able to get. Okay. Then you go to the Agora Phase, and that's going to be when the players take their turns, and they sequentially take turns, etc. A set of news cards. So here's a big difference between this and Republic of Rome. You've got a split between the news deck and the people deck. The people deck isn't just people cards, it's got the intrigue cards, etc. floated. And what the reasoning behind that is, instead of just flipping cards up and then you get first shot at a card if it's like a statesman or something, instead you're going to have a draft of the people cards at the end of the turn. So the news cards are going to involve a few major events, some wars, almost all of which are at Athens' option, which is a really interesting idea. It significantly changes the flavor of the game. Now, those optional wars, one thing that I was thinking about them is, the way I was playing them, they truly were optional. If we were seeing a game that lasted in the democracy longer, the Thetes, which loved to vote for war, could, in the hands, if one person wanted to force another war, they could do that. And that's something that would make the wars a little bit less optional, which is to say that people who aren't necessarily in control of the government could chime in and say, you know what, I think we want to do this. Unfortunately, those things don't have votes of any value after the oligarchy starts, and I hit the oligarchy right away, due to some lousy events and maybe a little bit of misplay on my side. But yeah, I thought I had a shot at taking the First Persian War out early, and then the Spartans abandoned me, and I got my ass handed to me. Okay. During each player turn, you have a very specific set of things that happen. You might turn over a news card. Usually, the first 3 players do. The next 3, there's a chance. And it might be automatic for some people. Those news cards have Hand of Death symbols on them, which are going to kill off one of the oldest statesmen. And this is a nice mechanism in terms of getting rid of the statesman early. One thing I mentioned in the last video was, it feels like there should be some random deaths in there. Rick assures me I didn't look through. I just checked my my YouTube comments, though, while I was making tea, and I'd already packed everything up. He assures me that there are some, but they must be very late in the deck, in the set of decks, which means maybe there should be some a little earlier. I don't know. Not too worried about it. The one problem with not having random deaths that happen outside of age or warfare or coups or whatever, is that players can kind of, and I don't know how big a deal this is from the playability point of view, from the gameplay point of view, players can say, you know what, I'm safe, and leave their money on someone, and that's no big deal. In terms of the realism point, you could say, well, you know that these people are going to survive, and that seems a little wrong, but I don't know how big a deal that is, because these are important personages. If they weren't going to survive, it would be maybe someone else. I don't know. Although once they do become kind of important, the chance of them dying, once they've done some stuff, the chance of them dying should certainly be there. So I think maybe the random deaths should probably extend a little deeper, even into the first deck. Not many, but some. Okay, what do we have here? Persuasion. So in Republic of Rome, persuasion is something you can do every turn. You point out a statesman who's not well protected and you can attack him if you have a card. You can make that easier. It's all very similar in this, with one big difference. Here you have to telegraph who you're going to try to persuade a turn in advance of when you do it. And if that telegraphing goes away, you no longer have the opportunity to persuade until you telegraph again to someone else. What that means is that players have a real chance to allocate a defense. I feel like it limits the number of persuasions that are done in a game, but I'm not sure that much. It was hard in Republic of Rome to persuade someone from someone else's faction until you got really, really potent. What it does mean is it's probably harder to just drain somebody's money. It used to be you could pick on people, targets of opportunity, and force money to come out onto a character or whatever. And that's still the case. It's just a slower process, and they could just put the money there anyway. I don't know. The biggest thing is those cards that allow you to get a persuasion on them without the defending player being able to defend. Those cards end up being much weaker. Because there's always a promise of, there's always an indication that somebody's going to go for it. And I have a battery problem, which I didn't think I'd have. So we're going to pause here. All right, well, I hope we get through it all. It seems to be, I don't know, I thought I had a full battery. Maybe I didn't. I don't remember specifically whether I checked. Okay. Otherwise, the persuasion mechanism is very similar to the Republic of Rome one. You're rolling a couple of dice to try to get under a difference between how well you are persuading to how loyal they are. One big difference is there's nothing to persuade that's out on the board. So everything you're persuading is going to have a loyalty number +7. This is kind of weird. As a standalone game, it doesn't make sense. It's like, well, why is the loyalty not the total target that you're going for that? It's kind of, I think, a leftover from loyalties that were created. Maybe it was more of a Republic of Rome design, and the decision was made to split the people deck and use the drafting and all this kind of stuff. But those numbers were never updated, so that could be troublesome if you haven't played Republic of Rome, I think, to try to understand. Okay. Then you have the opportunity to play a statesman from your hand or attract a follower. And followers are kind of important in democracy and a lot less important when you move to the oligarchy. And I went to the oligarchy really fast. Followers give you votes. Aristocratic followers give you money, and they don't give you much else. I think they have some other effect, like in trials or something like that, but we never really got to one of them. And then you're allowed to do one of the following: move your money around, or switch faction leader, sponsor an event, which is a way to buy yourself victory points, or buy a discard card. Buying a discard card is really important at certain points. In particular, during the oligarchy, buying troops is really important. If everybody's watching everyone else And they could buy, when they see someone else buying discards, they probably need to buy troops, unless they have an absolute idea of how many troops there were in there, just to make sure that somebody else can't win the game through a coup. Now, sponsoring an event is buying troops is expensive, though. It takes 10 talents off one of your personages, off one of your statesmen. Sponsoring an event takes at least 5 off one of your people, and 10 or 20 is more attractive. But you also have these needs to change your faction leader, maybe to get it off the oldest guy, or to protect someone because your faction leader can't be stolen from you. Or to redistribute funds. If you have somebody who's coming close to dying, you want to get the money off of them. Or you might want to pool money on someone so you can make a persuasion attempt or something like that. So, since you can only do one of any of these, and the Republic of Rome was similarly didn't really hammer down that or very well, so I could see people playing this as well as Republic of Rome being allowed to do all of these things. But it's really important that you not. It really limits your actions and puts you to making some hard choices during your turn. Which one of these things are you going to do? If place persuasion marker and persuade statesman could both be done, you'd have the same situation as Republic of Rome, and there's absolutely no reason to be placing the marker. Which is something I thought I saw at first until I noticed the or in the sequence of play. Okay. Now, if you're playing with less than 6 players, you can bid on additional initiatives, and those kind of change the rules in ways I don't even fully understand, because I think they allow you to draw cards from the people deck and stuff, which I find kind of weird, but it makes up for the fact that I'm not quite sure what it makes up for. It because just as many cards go into the discard pile. You're always drafting out of a deck of 7 or a hand of 7 cards. So I'm not really sure that additional people cards coming out makes sense. But until I see that happening, until I play a game with less than 6, I can't really talk about that. It just does strike me as a little weird. Then you go to the assembly phase, which is the political side of things. And what's going to happen there is first you have an election of the officers. Now, what's weird in this game, in comparison to Republic of Rome, Republic of Rome has one set of rules that more or less persist throughout the whole of the Republic. The Senate, the presiding officer suggests 2 councils. That set is voted on. The votes are largely the same. There might be some laws that modify some of this a little bit, but for the most part, the game plays the same throughout. This is not like that. This game starts off with an open voting where every statesman and their followers have votes, and then can go to the tribal voting, where each tribe you're starting to get to more representative democracy, where each tribe has its own voting, to tribal rotations, where you're actually selecting different members of the tribe to just represent, as opposed to the tribes voting as groups, and then finally to the oligarchy, where only the aristocrats are allowed to vote. I didn't get to see, though the 10 tribes actually was passed, probably illicitly, but I didn't get to see anything except the democracy and then a lot of the oligarchy. And the oligarchy is kind of funny because the players, remember, are restricted, and two of the players out of 6 are going to be aristocrats. The rest are not, and therefore they probably won't have aristocratic statesmen, and so they may have no vote. They usually will have no votes. So it comes down to, if you're playing a 3-player game, there's one person who has the votes. He is the only person who has the votes. He controls the government completely. If you're playing 4 or more, you have at least 2 aristocratic players, which may be why there's more aristocratic cards, because The aristocrats are the most important. They're the faction that gets in first, but it does make the 6-player game a little weird. But the the basic thing is that 2 players probably more or less control the government between them, and it's very hard to get it out of the person who actually holds the government at one time's hands and into the other faction that could hold the government's hands. And the other 4 factions are pretty much just along for the ride. They might get to do some things. They might get to, first of all, if they can persuade an aristocrat, they get to play to some extent. But also, they might be convinced. They might be given strategos in order to go to war if they have a good general or something like that, or just because there are only so many aristocrats to fill out the deck. And they might still get victory points and everything, but they don't really feel like they're playing that political game anymore. Yeah. And their main recourse to winning at that point is going to be the coups. Okay. And during the assembly phase, you are able... you have basically 2 sets of elections, as it were. Now, when democracy's in play, the first election is sort of automatic. There's one person who holds enough status that he is just viewed as the leading statesman. He doesn't have any title. When he achieves that rank, he gets some bonus popularity, which is victory points, and influence. If you can bop it between 2 characters back and forth, it looks like they can both just keep gaining popularity by their being like, but normally you don't get it voted in. So if you're sitting on that position, it doesn't really leave you as long as you're gaining things from it. And then you determine what forces Athens needs and what wars you're going to prosecute. Ooh, there's a recall commander phase. Yeah, I think the commanders do sit out there. That was not clear. Whether or not to build certain projects, pulling people back from exile, and repealing laws. Now, laws are kind of interesting, and they work the same as in Republic of Rome, and I never really liked it. You play a law, and it passes. You might be able to vote to remove the law, but just playing the law, automatically, everybody thinks it's a great idea no matter what. They're only playable during democracy, though, which means that there's a lot of rules in the game and a lot of cool little modifications to the way things work, including the increasing of troops, which cannot happen if you enter the oligarchy too soon, like I did. Which leaves you not seeing the full game as it, historically played out and as it's kind of designed to be. I ended up seeing a kind of mutant game. Players have an ability, generally only the presiding officer, the leading statesman, the archon, whatever, have the option to bring new proposals to the floor. However, you can use these Ecclesiastes cards or whatever to prevent a vote from being taken, to fail one thing. It's like the vetoes in Republic of Rome. And you immediately afterwards, and this is kind of a nice combination, because in Republic of Rome you could like tribune in to cause something, or you could tribune in to stop something. This gives you both. You tribune in to stop a proposal, and then you get another proposal. And I think that's a really nice idea, and I want to use that in Republic of Rome now. Just because usually you are left with like, well, great, I don't know if I can stop this, and I don't know. Maybe it's not necessary, but it makes those cards much more valuable. And that way, the problem with that is that the same presiding officer still determines the voting order, so they can kind of force the vote to go their way. because money can be thrown in on votes, and so any given vote can be skewed by the cash available. Then you go to wars, and that's gonna, well, let's talk a little bit about wars. So you end up with this pile of wars available to you, at least I did. And there's no real great reason to prosecute more than one of them. There may be cards that pull some of them out of the inactive status, but for the most part, it's your choice what you want to fight. You probably want to take the Persian Wars on to create the Delian League, because you may need that for the Spartan Wars. So you won't have Spartan allies, but you have the other allies. But for the most part, I felt like, you know, I didn't ever feel terribly threatened, except the turn that Athens would have fallen if I hadn't become an oligarchy. And then the Persian Wars were gone for good, unless a democracy came back. So I kind of felt, and even that's not clear from the rules. There are some places where the rules seem to have holes. Or my brain does. That's always a possibility. But there goes one of them holes right now. Yeah, you end up with a huge number of wars there. And, you know, you can just leave them there forever. There's no real reason to prosecute more than one at a time. Generally, it's worth bringing, you know, a big force of people out to prosecute a war. If a war is a tough war to fight, you probably can't attack it twice in one turn, which means you can't improve your odds against it. But if a war is an easy war, well, it's probably not worth that. You probably want to put all your eggs in one basket, because first of all, if you fail, you just fail. You can do it another turn. But there might be problems. But secondly, everybody who goes along on the war is going to get most of the benefits for the war. You all get the popularity from the war if you succeed. What you may not get is as much influence. Now, I haven't found collecting influence to be all that valuable in this. In the Republic of Rome, it's a victory condition, and therefore people try to avoid collecting too much influence. The big advantage to influence is that you can persuade people, but persuasion is hard. It's very easy to persuade out of the pool in Republic of Rome, so a moderately high influence was important in that. In this, having a very high influence meant that you could like be a threat of potentially persuading someone, but the actual number of successful persuasions was very, very low in the game. And I think only one that was done without a card play. And it was because somebody had no money left to throw in. Okay. You determine the combat. It's very much like in Republic of Rome. You roll chart your strength compared to the strength of the war, and you basically need to have 3 dice plus the difference in strength get you to a 14 or more to get a victory. And if you end up with a 7 or less, you have a defeat. And you'll take potential losses throughout. There are automatic results that come from the cards that can foil your best laid plans. But there are some leaders who prevent them for some wars. And then you take the spoils of war, which aren't much for Athens. They might get some cash. In a couple of cases, they get some income. But generally, the spoils are really just to the leaders. They get popularity and they get influence from it. Unless they lose. If they fail to win the war, they might get money. Huh? I don't know why they don't get money otherwise, but whatever. Then we come to something, this is completely different. Geez, now I think Founding Fathers may have something like this, or maybe the Expanded Fathers, but I don't think so. I don't remember it having this. Which is, you draw a pile of 7 people cards, and using kind of a catch-up mechanism, which is low victory points plus influence points, gets to draw first. You get to look at that stack and draw one card out of it, put it in your hand. And if your hand goes over hand size of 5, you have to discard something or play a card immediately. There are few cards that are really valuable to everyone, but usually everything in the deck, well, usually everything that's decent in the deck is decent to at least 2 players in a 6-player game. Basically, it's by faction. Certainly Statesman, you can't even pull a Statesman if it's the wrong faction. But there's business ventures, I'm going to call them concessions, that are only really valuable to statesmen of a certain faction. You're allowed to pull these and use them as trade bait, or if you have, a statesman of that class. What I noticed with those, the concession type cards, is some of them, and in Republic of Rome, they always go back out and they're available for the government to reallocate. Here, you can rebuy them for $10, but some of them aren't really worth $10. Some of them are, $2 a turn. Well, you take you 5 turns to recoup that. There's better things to buy, and money can be short, but not so short that you need that extra $2. So what I saw was those weren't usually getting bought back, although more valuable ones were going in, and we were at a point where maybe it would be worthwhile, but troops were too important. And now we come to the Coup, which I saw a lot of because Oligarchy came early. And the Coup is basically, you're going to be playing out a little mini game on the board up here. And you maneuver around in there. One space that has a defensive advantage and an advantage towards winning. Towards winning the coup. Now, whoever kind of declares the coup gets to set up first, has some advantages in that, and they basically have to either destroy the enemy, all the other players' troops, or they have to not be attacked and sit on the Acropolis, which is just kind of if they're up there, you had better do something about them, or else you're going to lose. So the way the coup's just resolved, it's got a cute little mechanism, and it plays out, and it's kind of fun to do. And there are many examples in my playthrough of it because I tend to like to video it. But the thing with the coup is, 4 of the 6 possible players are really kind of out of the game by the time the Oligarchy happens. And it may be that the only way that they can win the game is to throw a coup. Now, I started getting more worried towards the end of my game that actually all 6 players, the only way they could win is to throw a coup and make a tyranny. Because without that, the Spartan Wars were probably not winnable, because I had bailed and turned to Oligarchy after the first Persian War and didn't have the Delian League, and I didn't have the ability to build the extra troops that come off democratic laws that are later in the decks, and just a whole bunch of stuff prevented me from being in a position where I thought I could beat Sparta. Maybe I'm mistaken there. I would still get the allies, but I wouldn't have as big an army as I needed. There were a lot more army counters that could be produced if I wanted to beat Sparta. So, what that meant was, even if you were doing well and stocking aside lots of popularity, which is how you win the game if it makes it to the end, well, we'll talk about the victory conditions in a bit, because that's my biggest gripe. But even if you could collect up a lot of victory points, you wouldn't necessarily. It's quite possible. It looked likely that Athens wasn't going to make it there. So the coups end up being almost the only way to win the game. And the problem with the coups is that, like I said, if somebody's drawing cards out of that deck, you had better protect yourself by making sure you have some troops. And as long as a few people have troops, the coup is unlikely to succeed. Okay. Let's go back to the victory conditions, because that's where this game doesn't. That's where the game really starts having problems. So the defined victory conditions are unlike in Republic of Rome, which very explicitly sets itself up as a semi-co-op. Here, if the game makes it to the end of the game, the end of the cards, and Athens survives throughout, then whoever has the most popularity collected over the course of the game gets a win. Or, if someone succeeds in a coup, they get a win. Now, there's the faction depletion rule. I don't know. This is a special case in case a faction completely runs out, and I don't even know what this is. And I'm not going to hunt that down right here. But that would also cause a natural ending of the game. Now, in the case of a coup, if you declared the coup, you win. But otherwise, there's failure conditions for Athens. If it goes bankrupt, if it has too many active wars, if it loses a perilous war, or if it doesn't prosecute a perilous war. And in the last two cases, they have the option to play the 30 Tyrants, which turns into an oligarchy, which makes the coups available. Well, in the failure cases, I didn't check this, but okay. In the failure cases, you still win by your popularity vote, but there's a penalty of current votes and talents. And I did not see that. But all that means is if you're kind of in a strong position, you don't, like if you're in a game strong position, you may not be able to win even though you have the popularity. There's still going to be players who it's in their best interest to cause Athens to fall. And it's very easy if a small coalition of players who are doing poorly wanted to cause Athens to fall. Now, missing that is a big deal, and I wish I had seen that. Because, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. Because you could probably set yourself up to get rid of all your money if you're trying to fail things. If you know things are going to fail, you can figure out a way to get rid of a lot of money. You buy a big project or something. You buy a big games or something like that for $20 or something. You spend all your money and you give it to someone else on an attempt to take over one of their characters that fails. Or something. There are definite ways to get rid of a lot of money. Votes, well, I don't know what votes are, but under the aristocratic, under the oligarchy, votes are, can't fucking think, limited to your aristocrats, I think. Which means the players who aren't on the aristocratic factions aren't going to be penalized by that. That's going to cause some very pathological behavior. But the big thing I was worried about was at the very beginning of the game, some people might have a decent amount of popularity without a lot of votes. They could lose a character who had just gained some popularity early on. And then, well, unfortunately, my wife banging around down there caused me to not hear when the battery ran out. So this got cut off. I think the net effect is that there's a playable game with the victory conditions as written. That the disincentive for the people who have the most power in hand, i.e. votes and money, will prevent them from usually being willing to collapse Athens. And then the big question comes to, well, how do you feel about Athens being turned, away by, being destroyed possibly? Because there are conditions where it could happen. The game I was playing, here she comes again to make more noise. The conditions of the game that I was playing put Athens, put one particular faction in a position where they would want to destroy Athens based on their huge popularity gain to prevent anyone else from ever getting to that level. So basically, and certainly you could be in a position where you're not very popular, where you don't have that huge lead, but your faction's been reduced, where you might be able to push it over the edge, especially with the Thetes early in the game, during the democracy period, where you might be able to force Athens to fight wars that she can't win. The question there is, how common do you want Alcibiades to be within, the game? And essentially, there will always be one or two potential traitors sitting there among the different factions, which seems a little extreme to me. It seems to me that Alcibiades is a very particular case that shouldn't be kind of always lurking there, as in there are important people. There are important people in Athens who almost always will want the game to end. It may be a little harder to calculate than it would be, than I thought it was, where it's just like, oh yeah, I got the most popularity. And I don't think it's quite as pathological. Well, I know it's not quite as pathological as I was viewing it, because what I was viewing was generally the person who had the most victory points at a given point was also the person with the most power, and that was the person who could probably have the easiest chance of pushing Athens over the edge. However, I doubt that this game will make it too deep into the game without somebody crashing it, especially in the democracy period. Just because there are reasons that they'll be able to force Athens into a bunch of losing wars, when it's to their advantage. It's going to take more plays to tell, and it may take somewhat more complicated victory conditions to be able to determine whether or not. Yeah, it may take more complicated victory conditions to prevent misplay of the game. Now let's see if I lost video again while she was here. Nope, still got some battery left. I'm going to send this up. I can't tell you for sure whether or not this works. I have real concerns still, but it certainly works better than I thought it did earlier. Like when I was playing it, I was definitely of the opinion that, wow, if you play by the rules, you're going to generate pathological behavior, where there's some people who are powerful and know they can win and can push Athens over. And if you try to create a semi-co-op out of it where everybody loses, you may end up in the situation that I'm in, where the only way to win the game is via a coup. I'm not sure how much that bothers me, except that kind of like, well, because coups are kind of hard to pull off. They really are. If the other players are paying attention, they can prevent them. There was a bit of discouragement in other players' minds, though, as to, even the people who had a vested interest in keeping Athens alive because of their high popularity. They were like, well, geez, I don't know if I can win without a coup under these rules. All right, let's end it up this time.